The first thing one noticed about Cecily Hartwell, if one noticed her at all, was the stillness of her hands. She stood at the tea table in the Ashcroft drawing room on a gray Tuesday morning in October of 1814, lifting the silver pot with the particular care of a woman who understood what she was holding. The autumn light came through the tall Georgian windows in pale, insufficient bars, and it caught the engraved crest on the pot's body for a moment, before she tipped the spout and let it go. A thin column of amber fell through the strainer into the cup below. Her expression did not change. On the other side of the room, Lady Corwin was telling Mrs. Finch something about the autumn assembly at Harrowfield, gesturing with a fan that cost more than Cecily had been left when her father died. She moved to the second cup. "The musicians last season were dreadful," Lady Corwin was saying. "Edmund tried to be gracious about it. He is always gracious. One of his father's qualities, I think." She paused for effect. His father had so many. The tea fell through the strainer again. Cecily kept her eyes on the cups. Mr. Edmund Corwin, who had inherited Ashcroft 2 years ago when his second cousin's inheritance arrived, through the death of the last male Hartwell, and his father's cousin left no son, and with debts that made the entail's operation feel almost merciful by comparison, was not in the room. He was in the study, where he usually was at this hour, managing the estate he had not expected to inherit, and doing so with the slightly dazed conscientiousness of a man who knew he had benefited from something he had not deserved. He was not unkind. He was simply unable to look at Cecily directly, which was the next thing one noticed about him. And the thing she had counted on when she came back. She had been here 11 weeks. Lady Corwin had not advertised for a lady's companion, and yet Cecily had written to her on a Wednesday in late July, politely, from a boarding house in Bath where she had been surviving on the proceeds of 2 sold rings and the careful rationing of a quantity of pride, and had offered her services with the practiced humility of someone who had rehearsed the phrasing for 3 evenings before she committed ink to paper. She had given her surname as Ashworth. She had been careful about that. And Lady Corwin, who kept household accounts with the vigilance of a woman who had married into comfort without inheriting it naturally, had seen the offer for what it appeared to be: a gentlewoman fallen on difficulties, trained, presentable, and willing to accept a wage that would have shamed even a decent housekeeper. She had accepted by return post. In the boarding-house room in Bath, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed with Lady Corwin's letter in her lap, Cecily Hartwell had permitted herself the smile. Not the one she wore in company, the composed, neutral expression she had perfected over 2 years of being someone else, but the real one. The one that came from knowing something the other person did not. The teacups were full. She set the pot down and turned her eyes briefly to the silver strainer resting on its little dish beside the tray. It had been her mother's. She had known it would still be here, because Lady Corwin kept things, and because the Hartwell crest was pressed into its bowl in a way that made it feel like property rather than sentiment. She had watched it come out of the sideboard every morning for 11 weeks. She poured through it every morning. That was the particular quality of her situation. She served the family that had taken her inheritance with the tools her mother had left behind. She picked up the tray and carried it to where the ladies sat. "If you are moved to stay a little longer, I am glad for it." The story of how Cecily arrived at that drawing room and what she had come to collect is worth the knowing. Arthur Hartwell, Cecily's father, had died in March of 1812 on a cold evening in the library at Ashcroft, with his books around him and his affairs in what he had believed was reasonable order. He was 51 years old. The estate was entailed through the male line, which meant that upon his death, in the absence of a son, it passed to the nearest male Hartwell relation, That relation was his second cousin's stepson, Edmund Corwin, a young man of 27 who had no blood claim to the Hartwell name, but had the legal standing the entail required, because Edmund's mother had been born a Hartwell before she married, and the bequest was structured around the line rather than the blood in the elaborate way that such documents sometimes were. The solicitors explained this to Cecily in the front parlor with the kind of measured regret that comes from a long practice of delivering news for which no one is technically to blame. She had been 22 years old. She had £200 from her mother's marriage settlement, a small collection of books, and Ashcroft behind her as she drove away. Lady Corwin, Edmund's step-aunt by the old marriage, and the woman who ran the household with the same administrative confidence she had brought to the management of 2 previous domestic arrangements, had offered a single word at the moment of Cecily's departure. "Unfortunate," she had said, standing in the hallway with her hands folded, watching the trunk being loaded. She had said nothing further. In Lady Corwin's taxonomy, the word covered a wide country. In Bath, Cecily had spent 8 months being careful, and then 4 months being less careful, and then a winter being actively frightened. The £200 shrank. She took in mending. She gave 2 piano lessons a week to the daughters of a merchant on Pulteney Street, and was paid tolerably, and thanked not at all. She spent evenings at the small desk in her room writing letters to solicitors in London, asking careful questions about the specific language of her father's will, about the disposition of certain personal property not subject to the entail, about a letter of settlement her father had spoken of in the last month of his life. He had mentioned it twice. He had said it was handled. He had said she was not to worry. She had begun to suspect, in the year after his death, that he had been wrong. The specific document was a sealed undertaking between her father and the family solicitor, witnessed in the autumn of 1811, in which her father had directed that a sum of £4,000 from the sale of timber rights on the eastern parcel of the Ashcroft grounds, rights that were not entailed property, to be held in trust for his daughter Cecily upon his death, outside the terms of the estate settlement. The solicitor's firm had been dissolved 2 months before Arthur died. Its successor had absorbed certain files imperfectly, and the document, if it existed in the form she believed it did, was almost certainly here, in the Ashcroft Library. In the locked cabinet on the north wall behind the large globe, which had always been her father's cabinet, and which Lady Corwin had the key to now. That was the price Cecily had come to name. £4,000, and the timber rights document. Enough to live on for a decade. Enough to make the smile real. 11 weeks had not been enough time to find it. It was in the 5th week of her tenure at Ashcroft that the Earl of Hartfield arrived. She knew who he was before she saw him, because Lady Corwin had mentioned him 3 times in the preceding fortnight, with a particular quality of alertness in her voice, the kind that meant she was calculating something and had not finished. Lord Hartfield, Marcus Prentice, Earl of Hartfield, whose estate at Fenwick Park lay 6 miles to the north of Ashcroft, was a neighbor and had been her father's occasional dinner guest in the old years, which meant that Cecily had reason to keep her face composed when she heard his horse in the courtyard. She was in the corridor outside the drawing-room when he came in from the rain. He handed his coat to the footman and ran one hand through his dark hair, and when he lifted his eyes, he saw her standing 12 feet away with a pile of folded linens in her arms, and he stopped. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the linens and walked past him toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard no sound of resumption for a long moment. Only then did she hear his boots on the flagstone as he was shown into the study. She was asked to bring tea an hour later. She brought it on the Ashcroft silver tray, through the door Edmund's man held open, and she set it on the low table without looking at either of the men sitting across from each other. She was reaching for the pot when Lord Hartfield said quietly, "Thank you." It was not unusual in itself. One thanked the help or one did not, and Cecily had learned within the first week that Edmund did, and Lady Corwin rarely bothered. What caught at her attention was the word that followed, spoken not loudly, not obtrusively, offered as if it were merely the completion of a sentence already begun. "Miss," he said. She looked up. His black-gray eyes were level and attentive. He had a slight scar along his jaw, a thin white line she remembered vaguely from a dinner years ago. Some riding accident before the entail was a word she had reason to use. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that does not match the category he has placed it in. "My lord," she said. Her voice was even. She poured his tea and left the room. That evening she sat at the small writing desk in her room and was aware, with great precision, of her own pulse. She found the document in the 4th week after Lord Hartfield's first visit. She had not found it then. She had found something else entirely. Lord Hartfield himself was at Ashcroft more frequently than she had expected, and that each time he looked at her with that same quality of sustained, unsettled attention. She had found, also, that when she looked away first, the back of her neck registered the fact. At dawn on a Thursday, in the 6th week of his regular visits, she let herself into the library. She moved by the light of a single candle, because the fire had not been laid yet, and the dawn through the high windows was gray and cold. She went to the table in the center and opened the estate ledgers she had requested from Edmund's man under the pretense of helping Lady Corwin review the household accounts, a duty no one else wanted, and which Lady Corwin had assigned to her with genuine relief. She had been reading for 30 minutes when she heard the door. She did not close the ledger. She held the candle steady and waited. Lord Hartfield stood in the doorway in his coat, which meant he had come from the stables rather than from the house proper. He was not surprised to see her, which itself surprised her. He came into the room and stopped at a civil distance and looked at the ledger open on the table between them. "The timber records," he said. "I am reviewing the quarter accounts for Lady Corwin," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The dawn was beginning to gray the windows behind him, and she could see his face more clearly than she liked. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the name, which was not her name, landed in her chest like something cold. "The Eastern Timber parcel was sold 5 months before Mr. Hartwell died. The records on that page will not show you the sale. They will show you the result of it." She did not move. The candle flame was very still in the windless room. "Why," she said, "would you know that?" "Because your father asked me to witness the instruction for the proceeds," he said, "and I did. And I have spent the better part of 2 years wondering where that document went." The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the fire in the corridor beyond the door. "Sit down," he said quietly, and pulled a chair from beneath the table. And she understood then, with her whole body, that she had been seen. He told her that night, in the gray of early morning with the candle burning low between them, about the ward he had lost. Her name had been Clara Voss, the daughter of a tenant on his father's estate, who had died when Clara was 8, leaving the child to a maternal uncle who had no use for her and every use for the small bequest that traveled with her. Lord Hartfield had arranged in the year after his own father's death to have Clara made his ward, to bring her to Fenwick Park and give her a schoolroom and a governess and the ordinary protections of a house with someone who intended to see her grown well. He had done this because it had seemed the correct thing to do, and because Clara had a quality of serious attention that reminded him of something he could not name. The uncle had contested the guardianship the following spring, when Clara's bequest turned out to be larger than anyone had initially calculated. He had won. He had won because he had a solicitor who understood which arguments the court would accept and which it would not. And because Lord Hartfield had been slow to understand that the contest was not about Clara at all. Clara was 10 years old when she was taken back to her uncle's house in Derbyshire. She had left a small drawing of a horse on the schoolroom desk that Lord Hartfield had kept. "There are people," he said, and his voice was low and level, "who take things from those who have no instrument to hold them. And they are very often not cruel people. That is the particular quality of it. They are merely people for whom the machinery of the law is a tool they know how to use, and they use it, and they call the result settled." His eyes had not left her face while he spoke. She was aware of the table between them, of the precise 18 inches of candle-lit air between his hand, resting on the ledger's open page, and her own. "I know what you are doing here," he said. "I have known for 3 weeks. And you have said nothing," she said. "No," he said. "I have not." Her throat was tight in a way she had not expected. She had spent 2 years building the armature that kept her upright, and this man had taken it apart in a single conversation, and the strange thing, the alarming thing, was that she did not want it back. "The document," she said. "Do you know where it is?" "I have a copy," he said. "Properly witnessed. The original will be in the library cabinet, the north wall, behind the globe." She had looked at that cabinet every morning for 11 weeks. "Why?" she said carefully. "Did you not simply produce it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of a degree, not quite the warmth she had seen in another man's face in another life, but something adjacent to it. Something earned rather than performed. "Because," he said, "it was not mine to produce. It is yours. You came to find it yourself. I wanted to watch you succeed." She did not answer immediately. The candle between them had burned lower while he spoke, and in its diminished light his face had gone from the careful composure she had observed across 12 visits to something she did not have a ready word for. It was not tenderness, exactly, or not what she had been taught to recognize as tenderness. It was a quality of sustained attention that did not have anywhere to go. Her hands were in her lap. She had them still because she had made a practice of stillness over 2 years, and her body obeyed the instruction even now. The truth of it was that something in her chest had been moving since he said Clara's name, a slow shifting, like river ice in March, and she did not entirely trust it. "You could have produced the copy at any time," she said. "You could have written to Edmund's solicitor the week you understood what I was doing." "Yes," he said. "Why did you not?" His hand, resting on the open ledger, moved, not toward her, only a fraction of an inch, the fingers settling again on the page as if they had considered something and decided against it. She had seen that motion. She filed it away in the careful record she had been keeping of this man. "I have not been very good," he said slowly, "at watching people manage things on their own when I have the means to intervene. I have been working at the habit." The dawn was fully gray now in the windows behind him. The library would not remain empty for long. She knew that. She thought he knew it too, because they both remained where they were. The second dismissive label landed 3 weeks later. She was at the dinner table, in her correct place at the far end below the Finch family, who had come for the week with their daughter Arabella in tow. Miss Arabella Finch was 21 and very pretty, and wore the particular expression of a young woman who has been told often enough that she is the correct choice that she has begun to find the alternative possibilities tedious. She sat near Edmund and directed her best profile toward him with the patient competence of someone following a script that had always worked before. Mrs. Finch leaned toward Lady Corwin at the table center, and said in the carrying whisper of a woman who considers the help to be furniture, "And who is the young woman at the end? The plain one? With the quiet look?" Lady Corwin glanced down the table. She did not look at Cecily directly. "The poor relation," she said pleasantly. "One does what one can." Cecily reached for her water glass and found that her hand was perfectly steady. The candle nearest her threw its light against the cutlery and found nothing to settle on. She had heard the phrase before. She had heard it first on her third day at Ashcroft, when Lady Corwin had been showing Mrs. Alderton from the village through the east wing and had paused at the door of what had been Cecily's old bedroom, where Cecily was now making the bed. "The poor relation," Lady Corwin had said to Mrs. Alderton, indicating the room rather than its occupant. "Useful company for the winter, and these girls do need the occupation, I find." She had heard it the third time from the maid Polly, who had repeated it without thinking, carrying a tea tray in from the corridor and finding Cecily at the bottom of the servants' stair. "Mrs. Bunton says to tell you Lady Corwin said to use the back stair from now on," Polly had said, not unkindly. "On account of the poor relation business, guests expect." She had stopped when she saw Cecily's face. "I'm sorry, miss. She said it to Mr. Edmund this morning. I wasn't meant to hear." Cecily had smiled at the girl and said nothing. The cabinet key was where it had always been. She had not known this until the morning of the Thursday after the dinner, when Mrs. Bunton left it on the hall table with the other household keys while she went for the post, and Cecily passed by it and stopped. She had looked at the key for 11 seconds. Then she had picked it up and walked to the library. The document was there, folded, inside an envelope, in her father's hand, sealed with his old wax. She stood with it against the light from the window for long enough to confirm it was what she had believed it to be. Then she replaced it exactly where she had found it, locked the cabinet, and set the key back on the hall table before Mrs. Bunton had returned. She wrote to Lord Hartfield that afternoon. Lady Corwin summoned her 2 days later. "I am afraid," she said, and her voice carried the particular warmth of a woman delivering news she finds convenient, "that we will no longer require your services after the month's end. The household is to be reduced for the winter. It is nothing personal." Cecily stood in the doorway of Lady Corwin's sitting room and looked at her. "I am sorry to hear it," she said. She paused. "I wonder, Lady Corwin, whether you might know if a Mr. Grieve of the Prentice and Grieve firm in London intends to visit Ashcroft before the month is out. He wrote to me in some confusion about a settled matter. I had expected he might come in person." It was a careful sentence. She watched Lady Corwin's hands, which were in her lap around a small book, tighten very slightly. "I am not aware," Lady Corwin said, "of any such visit." "Then perhaps it is nothing," Cecily said. "Thank you, my lady." She had 3 weeks remaining. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came addressed not to her, but to Lady Corwin, which meant she saw it only when it had already been read, when Lady Corwin called her in with a face from which the social warmth had been very carefully removed, and held the letter in a way that meant she did not intend to share its contents. "It appears," Lady Corwin said, "that Lord Hartfield has engaged the firm of Grieve and Aldous to review a matter of personal property on this estate. He has asked that Edmund receive Mr. Grieve on Friday." Cecily kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Edmund has agreed?" she asked. "He has," Lady Corwin said. The word landed with no grace at all. The meeting on Friday was in the study. Cecily was not invited. She was, however, the person who brought the tea, and she set it down and stood at the door long enough to observe that Mr. Grieve, a thin man in a brown coat with the manner of someone who had once been asked to apologize for a mistake and had declined, was laying documents on Edmund's desk, and that Lord Hartfield was standing beside the window with his hands behind his back. saying nothing, and that Edmund's color had gone from its usual fair to something approaching white. Lord Hartfield looked up when she came in. She poured the tea and left. That evening, standing in her room with the sound of the house going quiet around her, she understood for the first time since she had arrived that something was going wrong. She had counted on certain things. She had counted on the month's notice being honored, on having 3 more weeks to find a way to get the document into the hands of someone who could act on it. She had counted on Lord Hartfield's copy being sufficient, but not final. What she had not counted on was the particular way he had looked at Edmund during the meeting. It had been the look of a man making a calculation. She had been glad to see it in the library when it had been turned on her. She was less glad now. She began to pack. She folded 2 dresses, a set of undergarments, her writing materials, and her mother's Bible into the small portmanteau she had arrived with. She worked methodically and did not allow herself to feel anything large. The portmanteau would not hold everything. But then she had not come with everything. She had come with what she could carry. The silver tea strainer was not in her room. It was downstairs on its dish by the tray, where it always was. She had not taken it. She had meant to. She had, in her plans over the past 11 weeks, imagined herself walking out of Ashcroft with it tucked into her glove as the only thing she would take that she had not been given. Now she sat on the edge of the bed and understood that she was not going to collect it, and that this fact was the clearest evidence yet that something had broken in the architecture of her composure. She did not want the document only. She had wanted the document for 2 years, and that want was clean and justified, and hers in a way that required no examination. The other thing she wanted, which had grown without her authorization across 12 weeks of libraries and corridors, and a gray candle-lit morning, and a man's hand that had moved toward her and decided against it, was not clean at all. It was inconvenient and poorly timed, and bore no resemblance to the careful plan she had arrived with. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the portmanteau. The Bible was in it. She had been very practical. She was on the 2nd dress when there was a knock at her door. It was Polly. The girl was flushed, her cap slightly crooked, and she was holding a small folded note in one hand. "From Lord Hartfield, miss," she said. "He's downstairs. He said to say he'll wait." Cecily looked at the portmanteau. She looked at the note. She opened it. 3 words in a spare, decisive hand. "Trust me. Please." She sat down on the edge of the bed and held the note and waited for the thing in her chest to stop moving. It did not stop. It was the kind of movement that has no rational name, the body making a declaration the mind has not authorized. She set the note on the Bible and finished packing the 2nd dress. Then she closed the portmanteau and went downstairs. He was in the corridor below, in his coat, with the look of a man who had expected her to take longer. "Mr. Grieve will be here tomorrow morning," he said. "I know," she said. "Lady Corwin intends to tell Edmund that the document was destroyed in the solicitor's fire," he said. "She spoke to him this afternoon, after the meeting. I was not invited, but the wall between the study and the corridor is not thick." She looked at him. "She does not know," he said, "that I have a copy." The silence was very still between them. The hallway was cold. She had not brought a shawl. "You have been protecting the document," she said. Not a question. "I have been waiting," he said, "for the right moment to produce it, which is not tonight. Tonight is not the right arena." She was aware of her own breathing, of the precise distance between them. His scar was more visible in the hall light, a thin, pale mark along the jaw. "What is the right arena?" she said. Lady Corwin's afternoon tea, he said. Tomorrow. Mrs. Finch is still in residence. The Alderton family is expected. Edmund will be present. If the document is produced in the drawing room, in front of witnesses, and if the solicitor is present to confirm it, then the entailment of the personal property from the timber sale is settled. You arranged for them all to be present, she said. I invited the Aldertons, he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The heat in her face had nothing to do with the cold corridor, and she was aware of his hands in a way that was not practical or strategic or calculated. She had been calculating for 2 years. She was very tired of it. If this does not succeed, she said, I will have nothing. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said her name. Cecily. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Ashworth. Not the name she had given Lady Corwin. Her name, offered in his low and level voice, in a cold corridor, as if he had been holding it for some time and had decided the moment had arrived to give it back to her. She could not speak. She stood very still with her hands at her sides. I will be there, he said, at 3 o'clock. She went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without unpacking the portmanteau. The afternoon tea was laid at 2:30 in the drawing-room at Ashcroft. Mrs. Finch and Miss Arabella were on the settee near the window. Mr. and Mrs. Alderton from the village occupied the chairs to the left of the fireplace. Edmund stood near the mantelpiece with the expression of a man who has been told to expect something, but not what. Lady Corwin presided over the table in pearl gray silk, with the tea things arranged before her, and the silver pot, and the strainer with the Hartwell crest, and the particular air of a woman who has managed many rooms and expects to manage this one. Mr. Grieve sat beside the writing desk in his brown coat, a leather case on his knee. Cecily stood at the small side table with the extra cups, in her gray-green dress, in her correct position, visible enough to be useful, invisible enough to be disregarded. She had been standing in that position for 11 weeks. She knew the geometry of the room perfectly. She knew where the light came through the tall windows and where it did not reach. At 3 o'clock exactly, Lord Hartfield was shown in. He came through the door and paused, taking in the room with the efficiency of a man who has arranged an outcome and is verifying that the pieces are in place. His eyes found Cecily. They held there for 1 second, and then he crossed to Edmund and offered his hand, and Edmund shook it with the expression of someone performing a task he has not understood. Edmund, Lord Hartfield said, thank you for receiving me. Of course, Edmund said. He glanced at Lady Corwin. I have asked Mr. Grieve to attend, Lord Hartfield said, settling his coat and turning toward the room in a way that addressed everyone present, without announcing that he was doing so. Because the matter I have come to raise is a legal one, and I believe it is properly settled with witnesses. Lady Corwin's hand at the pot had gone very still. I am not aware, she said pleasantly, of any outstanding matter of a legal nature at Ashcroft. No, Lord Hartfield said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. I did not expect you to be. He turned toward Edmund. In the autumn of 1811, your second cousin Arthur Hartwell directed that the proceeds of a timber rights sale from the eastern parcel of this estate, proceeds amounting to £4,000, the sale of rights that were not subject to the entail, to be held in trust for his daughter. He paused. Mr. Grieve has the original document from the cabinet in the library. I hold here a witnessed copy. Edmund had gone white again. Miss Arabella had stopped looking at her profile entirely and was looking at Cecily. Mrs. Alderton had placed her teacup in her saucer with the delicate care of a woman who is paying very close attention. The proceeds, Lady Corwin said, and her voice had lost a fraction of its pleasantness, were disbursed in settlement of the estate's debts. They were not, Mr. Grieve said, quietly, from his chair. I have reviewed the accounts for the period. They were not. The room held its breath. Lord Hartfield did not look at Lady Corwin again. He turned, and he crossed the room, and he stopped before Cecily, and in the silence produced by 12 people watching, he held out the folded copy. She took it. She is Miss Hartwell of Ashcroft, he said to the room, to Edmund, to the Aldertons, to Mrs. Finch, who had her hand at her mouth, to Lady Corwin, whose fan had closed in her lap. And she has always been. The silence lasted long enough to be a verdict. In it, Cecily was aware of a number of things simultaneously. She was aware of his hand, which had delivered the document into hers, and had not yet moved far from her. She was aware of the precise quality of the afternoon light through the tall Ashcroft windows, the same windows she had looked out of on mornings when she had been a girl in this house, and had not yet understood what it meant that there was no male heir and her father was 50, and not well. She was aware of Miss Arabella Finch sitting very straight on the settee, her best profile temporarily suspended in something more honest. She was aware of Mrs. Alderton, whose expression had gone from the alert attention of a careful witness to something that looked, if Cecily read it correctly, rather like satisfaction. And she was aware, in the silence, that she wanted this man to stay beside her in the room. Not because the document was in her hands, not because the room needed a witness to what had just been said. She wanted it in the way she had spent 11 weeks not wanting things, in the way that had nothing to do with what was strategic, in the way her hands knew before her mind gave permission. Edmund said, "Good God," in a low voice, and sat down. Lady Corwin did not fragment. She was too composed for that, too long practiced. The fan in her lap turned once, twice, a small and useless motion, and she looked at Cecily with an expression that was not quite regret and not quite recognition, but was something between the two that had no comfortable name. Mr. Grieve spoke for several minutes about the document and the trust and the means by which its existence would be confirmed with the relevant parties in London. Miss Finch excused herself to find her handkerchief. The Aldertons drank their tea with the concentrated attention of people who understand they are witnesses to something and intend to remain equal to it. Cecily held the document in her hands. It was her father's seal. It was her father's hand on the direction. She had looked for it for 2 years, and here it was, warm from Lord Hartfield's coat. He was standing to her left at a civil distance, and she could feel him there. Not looking at her now, giving her the room. She had poured her last cup of tea for this family that morning, and she had poured it without shaking, and she had smiled. The rooms at Ashcroft that were returned to Cecily's possession by December of 1814 were not the grandest rooms in the house. Edmund retained the estate proper under the terms of the entail, which was not in dispute, because the entail had never been the point. The £4,000 from the Timber Trust was settled with the appropriate legal ceremony the following month, and with it the timber rights themselves, which meant she had an income and a claim, and her own name restored to the records of the estate, and the right to say she was of Ashcroft whether or not she lived in its principal rooms. She chose not to live in its principal rooms. Fenwick Park was 6 miles north, and by the spring of 1815, the announcement had been made quietly in the way of 2 people who have already decided and merely require the world to catch up. There was no great season surrounding it. There was a small ceremony at the church at Harrowfield with the Aldertons and a cousin of Lord Hartfield's, who came down from York and wept with cheerful thoroughness throughout. Edmund shook Lord Hartfield's hand and could not look at Cecily. which was the same as it had always been, except that now she found it rather more amusing than before. On the afternoon of the day, she moved her things to Fenwick Park. She went to the Ashcroft drawing room one last time. The tea things were laid, and no one was about. She lifted the silver strainer from its dish by the pot. It was small in her palm. The Hartwell crest was cold from the October air coming through the windows. She put it in her pocket and walked out. That evening, at Fenwick Park, the fire was laid in the sitting room, and the light from it moved along the walls in the way that good firelight does, slow and certain, with nothing to prove. Lord Hartfield sat across from her in the chair that had always been his, and between them on the small table were 2 cups of tea that someone else had made, and had poured, and had brought without being asked. She reached into her pocket and set the strainer on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. She had last worn the smile of the title on the morning she walked out of Ashcroft carrying the strainer and everything that went with it. The smile she wore now, in the firelight, with her hands in her lap and the sound of the house settling around her, was different. Not a tool, not a calculation, just hers. He leaned forward and poured her tea through the Hartwell crest, and she let him, and the amber fell through in a thin and perfect column, and the fire said nothing, and outside the first snow of November was beginning to settle on the grounds of Fenwick Park in the dark. If this story moved you, I am glad to have told it. Leave a word in the comments, if you like, for Cecily and her quiet price. Until next time.